A damp night covers deserted streets as a German shepherd moves through soaked trash bags. Under a faint light, it finds an abandoned baby wrapped in dirty rags. Without a sound, the dog holds the small body between its teeth. A half-open gate creaks in the wind. An elderly woman peers from the window. The animal deposits the baby at her feet and moves away, watching the street. A black car appears, headlights off, men get out in silence. The dog returns, eyes fixed on the gate. But what happens next? Love stories with animals? Then subscribe now and don't miss any. Thank you for following us. Now back to our story. The rain hammered against the cracked asphalt of Elm Street in Willowbrook, Tennessee, each drop echoing like tiny bullets against the abandoned shopping carts and overflowing dumpsters that lined the forgotten corner of town. The storm had been raging for hours, turning the narrow alleyways into rivers of murky water that carried the debris of a neighborhood that time seemed to have left behind. Rex, a German shepherd, whose golden coat had long since lost. Its lustrous shine prowled through the maze of wet cardboard and scattered refuse. His ribs showed slightly beneath his matted fur, testament to the countless meals he'd missed while navigating the harsh reality of street life. Yet his amber eyes still held the intelligence and dignity that marked his breed, even as they darted, constantly between shadows, alert for both opportunity and danger. The storm had driven most people indoors, leaving the streets to the strays and the desperate. Rex had learned to love these moments of solitude when the world belonged only to those who truly understood its unforgiving nature. His paws splashed through puddles as he made his way past the row of modest houses that stood like weathered sentinels against the night. It was then that he heard it, a sound so faint it might have been mistaken for the wind whistling through broken fences. Rex's ears perked up, swiveling toward the source. The sound came again, a weak cry that seemed to emanate from beneath a pile of garbage bags that had been carelessly stacked against a chain-link fence. Without hesitation, Rex approached the pile, his nose working overtime to process the overwhelming mixture of scents. Rotting food, stale water, and something else, something that made his protective instincts surge to life. Using his powerful snout, he began to push aside the wet bags, each movement deliberate and careful. What he uncovered made him freeze. Wrapped in what appeared to be a soggy baby blanket, barely visible among the refuse, was a tiny human infant. The baby's cries were weak but persistent, small fists waving helplessly in the cold night air. Rex's heart, hardened by months of survival, suddenly felt a pull he couldn't explain. The child couldn't have been more than a few days old, and hypothermia was clearly setting in. Rex could see the blue tinge around the baby's lips, could sense the life force ebbing away with each passing moment. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to act, to protect this most vulnerable of creatures. Gently, more gently than he had ever handled anything in his life, Rex took the edge of the blanket between his teeth. The baby's weight was almost nothing, yet it felt like the most precious cargo he had ever carried. Slowly, carefully, he lifted the infant from its makeshift bed among the garbage. The rain continued to fall as Rex began his journey through the streets of Willowbrook, his mouth carefully positioned to support the baby while keeping it safe from the elements. Each step was measured, each turn calculated to avoid the deeper puddles and the sharper corners that might jostle his tiny passenger. He knew exactly where he was going. 3 blocks away on Maple Avenue stood a small white house with blue shutters that had caught his attention many times during his nocturnal wanderings. Unlike most of the other homes in the neighborhood, this one always seemed to have a warm light glowing in one of the windows, even in the deepest hours of the night. More importantly, Rex had observed the woman who lived there. She was elderly, perhaps in her 70s, with silver hair that she kept neatly pinned back and a way of moving that spoke of both frailty and determination. He had seen her leave food scraps on her back porch, had watched her chase away the teenagers who sometimes threw rocks at the stray cats that gathered near her property. Margaret Thompson had lived in the house on Maple Avenue for 43 years, ever since she and her late husband Robert had bought it as newlyweds. She had raised 3 children within those walls, had weathered decades of joys and sorrows, and had learned to find comfort in the quiet routines that filled her days. Tonight, she sat in her favorite rocking chair by the living room window, a cup of chamomile tea growing cold in her hands. Sleep had become elusive in recent years, and she often found herself keeping vigil with the night, watching the rain streak down the glass and listening to the familiar creaks and sighs of her aging home. It was the scratching at her front door that first caught her attention, soft but persistent, like someone trying to get her attention without wanting to wake the entire neighborhood. Margaret set down her teacup and moved slowly toward the door, her arthritis making each step a small negotiation with pain. She had always been cautious about opening her door to strangers, especially at this hour, but something about the sound made her pause with her hand on the deadbolt. It wasn't the aggressive pounding of someone with ill intentions, nor was it the timid tapping of someone who might simply be lost. "Who's there?" she called softly through the door, though she didn't really expect an answer. The response came not in words, but in a low, almost pleading whine that made her heart skip. Margaret had grown up around dogs, had loved them all her life, and she recognized the sound of an animal in distress. Throwing caution to the wind, she unlocked the door and opened it just wide enough to peer outside. What she saw nearly stopped her heart entirely. There, soaked to the bone and shivering on her doorstep, stood the German shepherd she had glimpsed occasionally roaming the neighborhood. But it wasn't the dog's bedraggled appearance that made her gasp. It was what he carried so carefully in his mouth. "Oh, my lord," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "Oh, my sweet lord, what have you brought?" "Me?" Rex looked up at her with eyes that seemed to hold an ancient wisdom, then gently lowered his head to place the bundle at her feet. The baby, though obviously cold and weak, was very much alive, its tiny chest rising and falling in a rhythm that spoke of stubborn determination to survive. Margaret's hands trembled as she bent down to gather the child into her arms. The moment the baby felt human warmth, its cries intensified, though whether from relief or discomfort she couldn't tell. Rex remained perfectly still, watching her every movement with an intensity that was almost human in its concentration. "Come in," Margaret found herself saying, stepping aside to let the dog enter her home. Rex hesitated for only a moment before crossing the threshold, shaking the worst of the rain from his coat as he settled near the door. Margaret carried the baby into her kitchen, her mind racing as she tried to process what had just happened. The child appeared to be healthy, despite its ordeal, though clearly in need of immediate warmth and nourishment. She wrapped the baby in a clean dish towel while she heated some water on the stove, her movements automatic, despite the surreal nature of the situation. As she worked, she found herself stealing glances at Rex, who had positioned himself in the doorway where he could keep watch on both the baby and the street outside. There was something almost supernatural about the way he had appeared at her door, carrying this precious cargo through the storm. "Where did you find this little angel?" she murmured to the dog, though she knew he couldn't answer. Rex's ears twitched at the sound of her voice, but his gaze remained fixed on the bundle in her arms. The baby was beginning to warm up, its cries becoming stronger and more demanding. Margaret found herself smiling despite her confusion and concern. It had been so many years since she had held an infant, since her own grandchildren had been small enough to fit in her arms this way. But even as she marveled at the tiny miracle that had been delivered to her doorstep, questions began to crowd her mind. Who could have abandoned such a beautiful child? And why in such a terrible place, left to the mercy of the elements? The very thought made her hold the baby closer, a fierce protectiveness rising in her chest. Rex remained vigilant by the door, his senses alert to every sound from the street. Occasionally, he would lift his head, listening to something Margaret couldn't hear, then settle back into his watchful pose. It was as if he understood that his job was far from over, that bringing the baby to safety was only the beginning of whatever story was unfolding. As the night wore on and the storm began to subside, Margaret found herself changing the baby's improvised diaper and attempting to feed it small sips of warm sugar water. The child seemed to be responding well, its color improving and its movements becoming more animated. But with each passing hour, the reality of her situation became more apparent. She had no legal right to this child, no way of explaining how a baby had come to be in her possession. Yet the thought of turning the infant over to authorities, of sending it into the uncertain machinery of the foster care system, filled her with dread. Rex seemed to sense her internal struggle. Several times throughout the night, he approached her chair and gently nuzzled her free hand, as if offering comfort and encouragement. It was a remarkable display of empathy from an animal that had every reason to trust no one. As dawn began to creep across the horizon, Margaret made a decision that would change the course of all their lives. She would keep the baby safe, at least for now, until she could figure out what had really happened and what was best for the child. She had no idea that her simple act of compassion would soon draw the attention of forces far more powerful and dangerous than anything her quiet neighborhood had ever seen. The morning sun streamed through Margaret's lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the hardwood floors of her living room. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and gleaming with remnants of the night's drama. Margaret sat in her rocking chair, the baby sleeping peacefully in her arms, wrapped in one of her own soft cotton nightgowns that she had hastily converted into makeshift infant clothing. Rex lay nearby, his powerful body stretched across the threshold between the living room and the hallway, positioned where he could monitor both the baby and any approach to the house. Even in sleep, his ears remained alert, twitching at every sound from the awakening neighborhood. Margaret hadn't slept at all. Instead, she had spent the hours watching the child's peaceful breathing, marveling at the perfect tiny fingers and the way the baby's mouth moved occasionally as if dreaming of feeding. She had managed to give the infant some warm milk, mixed with a little honey, using a clean cloth as a makeshift feeding tool, and had been relieved when the baby had taken it eagerly. The child appeared to be perfectly healthy despite the terrible circumstances of its abandonment. Margaret estimated the baby to be no more than 3 or 4 days old, based on the still healing umbilical cord area. The thought of someone discarding such a precious life made her stomach turn, but it also strengthened her resolve to protect this innocent soul. As the neighborhood began to stir with the sounds of morning routines, Margaret found herself facing the practical realities of her situation. She had no infant supplies, no legal documentation for the child, and no clear plan for what came next. Yet somehow, looking down at the sleeping face, none of that seemed to matter as much as simply keeping the baby safe and loved. The first knock on her door came at exactly 9:30 in the morning. Rex was instantly alert, rising to his feet with a low growl that rumbled deep in his chest. Margaret felt her heart rate quicken as she clutched the baby closer. Through her front window, she could see a white sedan parked at her curb, its government license plates clearly visible even from her chair. "Mrs. Thompson?" The voice was professional, authoritative. "This is Detective James Morrison with the Willowbrook Police Department. We'd like to ask you a few questions if you have a moment. Margaret's mind raced. How could they possibly know to come here? She had told no one about the baby, had made no calls, had done nothing that should have drawn official attention. Rex moved closer to her chair, his body tense and ready, as if he too sensed that this visit spelled potential danger. "Mrs. Thompson?" The voice came again, followed by another series of knocks. "We know you're home. We just want to talk." Taking a deep breath, Margaret stood slowly, adjusting the baby to rest against her shoulder. She approached the door with Rex at her side, his presence both comforting and concerning. What would these men think of the large stray dog in her home? "Yes?" she called through the door, not yet ready to open it. "Ma'am, we're investigating. Reports of unusual activity in your neighborhood last night during the storm. A neighbor mentioned seeing a dog carrying something to your house. We'd like to verify that everything is all right." Margaret's blood ran cold. Someone had been watching. Someone had seen Rex bring the baby to her door and had felt compelled to report it. The realization that she was already under scrutiny made her protective instinct surge even stronger. "Everything is fine, officer," she replied, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "I did let a stray dog take shelter from the storm, but there's nothing unusual about that." There was a pause, then the sound of muffled conversation between multiple people. Rex's growl deepened, and Margaret could feel the tension radiating from his powerful frame. "Mrs. Thompson, we're going to need you to open the door. This is part of an active investigation, and we have the authority to verify the welfare of any individuals on the premises." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. They knew about the baby. Somehow they already knew, and they were here to take the child away. The thought of handing over this innocent infant to people who might not have its best interests at heart made her feel physically ill. But she also knew that refusing to cooperate would only make things worse. With trembling hands, she unlocked the door and opened it just wide enough to see two men in dark suits standing on her porch. Detective Morrison was tall and thin, with graying hair and the kind of face that revealed nothing. His partner, who introduced himself as Detective Williams, was younger and stockier, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in every detail of Margaret's appearance. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson," Detective Morrison said, his tone polite but firm. "As I mentioned, we're investigating some unusual activity in the area. May we come in?" Margaret hesitated, aware that Rex had moved to stand directly behind her, his imposing presence visible to the men on her porch. She saw Detective Williams's hand move instinctively toward his jacket, and she quickly spoke up. "The dog is friendly," she said quickly. "He's just protective. He's been through a lot on the streets." "I'm sure he has," Detective Morrison replied, though his eyes never left Rex's alert form. "Mrs. Thompson, we have reason to believe that there may be a missing infant involved in last night's events. I'm going to ask you directly, do you have a baby in your home?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret felt the weight of the sleeping child against her shoulder, felt Rex's steady presence at her back, and knew that this moment would determine everything that happened next. "Yes," she said quietly, "I do." The transformation in both detectives was immediate. Detective Williams stepped forward, his expression becoming more intense, while Detective Morrison adopted a more official tone. "Mrs. Thompson, we're going to need you to step aside and allow us to verify the condition and identity of the child. This is now an official matter involving child welfare." "But you don't understand," Margaret began, clutching the baby protectively. "This child was abandoned, left in the garbage to—" "Ma'am," Detective Morrison interrupted, "we understand this may be a complicated situation, but we need to follow proper procedures. The infant needs to be examined by medical professionals and processed through the appropriate channels." Rex stepped forward, inserting himself between Margaret and the detectives. His posture was not aggressive, but it was unmistakably protective. The message was clear. Anyone who wanted to get to Margaret and the baby would have to go through him first. "Mrs. Thompson," Detective Williams said, his voice taking on a warning tone, "you need to control that animal. We're trying to handle this situation peacefully, but we will take whatever measures are necessary to ensure the safety of the child." "Rex won't hurt anyone," Margaret said, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true if these men tried to take the baby by force. "He's the one who brought the baby to me. He saved this child's life." The detectives exchanged glances, and Margaret could see that this information was news to them. Detective Morrison pulled out a small notebook and began writing. "You're saying the dog brought you the infant?" he asked. "Can you tell us exactly what happened?" For the next 20 minutes, Margaret recounted the events of the previous night, from Rex's scratching at her door to her discovery of the abandoned baby. The detectives listened without interruption, occasionally making notes or asking for clarification on specific details. Throughout her account, Rex remained vigilant, his attention divided between the men asking questions and the baby in Margaret's arms. Several times, when one of the detectives shifted position or reached for something, Rex would tense, ready to intervene if necessary. "Mrs. Thompson," Detective Morrison said when she finished her story, "while we appreciate your compassion, in this situation, you must understand that there are legal procedures that must be followed. The child needs to be placed in protective custody while we investigate its origins and determine the appropriate course of action." "But I can care for the baby," Margaret protested. "I raised 3 children of my own. This child is safe and loved here." "That may be true," Detective Williams interjected, "but you have no legal standing in this matter. The infant is technically evidence in what may be a criminal investigation. We have protocols to follow." The word evidence made Margaret's heart sink. The idea of this beautiful, innocent child being treated as nothing more than a piece of evidence in some bureaucratic puzzle was almost unbearable. "What kind of criminal investigation?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. The detectives exchanged another look before Detective Morrison responded. "We can't discuss the details of an ongoing investigation, but I can tell you that this case involves more than simple abandonment. There are other factors at play that require a higher level of scrutiny." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. Other factors? What could that possibly mean? And how had these men known to come to her house so quickly? The timing seemed too perfect, too convenient, as if they had been waiting for exactly this situation to arise. "I need to make some phone calls," Detective Morrison announced, stepping toward their sedan. "Williams, stay here and make sure the situation remains stable." As one detective walked away, Margaret found herself alone with Detective Williams, Rex, and the baby. The young detective seemed less intimidating than his partner, but his eyes held a watchfulness that made Margaret uncomfortable. "Mrs. Thompson," he said quietly, "I want you to know that we're not the enemy here. Our job is to protect children, and that includes this baby. But there are forces at work in this situation that are bigger than what you see on the surface." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Detective Williams glanced toward the street, where his partner was engaged in what appeared to be an intense phone conversation, then looked back at Margaret with an expression that seemed almost sympathetic. "Let's just say that not everyone who's interested in this baby has the child's best interests at heart," he said cryptically. "And the fact that you've become involved, however innocently, may put you in a position you're not prepared for." Rex's ears perked up at something in the detective's tone, and he moved closer to Margaret's side. The baby stirred in her arms, making small sounds that reminded her of the child's vulnerability and complete dependence on the adults around it. "Are you trying to warn me about something?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before Detective Williams could answer, his partner returned from the car, his expression grim and his demeanor noticeably more tense than when he had left. "Change of plans," Detective Morrison announced. "Mrs. Thompson, you're going to be allowed to keep the baby temporarily, but under strict conditions. You're not to leave town, you're not to discuss this case with anyone, and you're to report any unusual activity or contact immediately." Margaret felt a surge of relief mixed with apprehension. "I can keep the baby?" "Temporarily," Detective Morrison emphasized. "This situation is being handled at a very high level, and there are considerations that go beyond normal child welfare procedures. But for now, the decision has been made that the child is safest remaining in your care." As the detectives prepared to leave, Detective Morrison handed Margaret a business card with multiple phone numbers written on it. "Any hour, day or night," he said seriously. "If anything unusual happens, if anyone contacts you, if you notice anything out of the ordinary, you call immediately. Do you understand?" Margaret nodded, still trying to process what had just happened. As the white sedan pulled away from her curb, she found herself standing in her doorway with Rex beside her and the baby in her arms, feeling as if she had just been thrust into the middle of something far more complex and dangerous than she could have imagined. The morning sun, that had seemed so peaceful earlier now, felt harsh and exposing, and Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that unseen eyes were watching her every move. 3 days had passed since the detective's visit, and Margaret had settled into an unexpected routine with the baby, whom she had taken to calling Hope, a name that seemed to fit the child's miraculous survival. Rex had become an integral part of their small household, appointed himself as the baby's primary guardian, and rarely left the infant's side except when absolutely necessary. Margaret had made a trip to the local pharmacy to buy essential baby supplies, using cash and keeping her head down to avoid unnecessary attention. The owner, Mrs. Chen, had been curious about Margaret's sudden need for infant formula and diapers, but had tactfully refrained from asking direct questions. Still, Margaret could feel the weight of unspoken inquiries following her as she made her way home. The baby was thriving under Margaret's care, gaining weight and becoming more alert with each passing day. Hope had begun to recognize Margaret's voice and would calm immediately when she spoke, tiny hands reaching toward the sound. Rex seemed fascinated by these interactions, often positioning himself where he could observe both Margaret and the baby, his intelligent eyes tracking every movement. It was Thursday evening when Margaret noticed the first envelope. She had been preparing Hope's evening feeding when Rex suddenly became agitated, pacing between the front door and the kitchen with an energy that set Margaret on edge. His behavior was different from his usual vigilance, more urgent, more concerned. "What is it, boy?" Margaret asked, but Rex only continued his restless movement, occasionally stopping to stare intently at the front door. When Margaret finally went to investigate, she found a plain white envelope that had been slipped under her door. Her name was written on the front in careful block letters, but there was no return address, no postmark, nothing to indicate where it had come from. Rex watched intently as she opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief message written in the same careful handwriting. "Trust no one in uniform. The baby's life depends on your silence. More information will come." Margaret's heart pounded as she read the words twice, then 3 times, trying to make sense of their meaning. Someone was warning her, but who? And warning her about what? The detectives had seemed professional, if somewhat mysterious, but could there be more to their interest in Hope than they had revealed? Rex approached and sniffed the paper, his nose working to process any scent that might provide clues about its origin. After a moment, he looked up at Margaret with an expression that seemed almost human in its concern. "What do you think, Rex?" she whispered. "Should we trust this warning?" As if in response, Rex moved to the window and peered out at the street, his body tense and alert. Margaret joined him and was disturbed to see a dark sedan parked across the street. Not the same car the detectives had driven, but similar enough to make her nervous. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see who might be inside. The car remained there for 2 hours before finally driving away, but its presence left Margaret feeling exposed and vulnerable. She found herself checking the locks on her doors multiple times that night, and was grateful for Rex's reassuring presence in the hallway outside Hope's makeshift nursery. The next morning brought another surprise. Margaret was hanging laundry in her small backyard when Rex began digging frantically near the corner fence, his powerful paws sending dirt flying in all directions. At first, Margaret thought he might have caught the scent of a buried animal, but his behavior seemed too purposeful, too directed. "Rex, what are you doing?" she called, but the dog continued his excavation with single-minded determination. When he finally stopped and stepped back, Margaret could see that he had uncovered something metallic buried just beneath the surface. Curious and slightly apprehensive, she approached and carefully brushed away the remaining dirt. What she found made her gasp. It was a small, waterproof container, the kind used by hikers and campers to protect important documents. Inside, wrapped in plastic, was a hospital bracelet that appeared to have been torn or cut from someone's wrist. The bracelet was pink, indicating it had belonged to a new mother, and though most of the information was smudged or worn away, Margaret could make out a few crucial details. The name Rebecca was still partially visible, along with what appeared to be a date from just over a week ago. Most intriguingly, there was a medical record number that was still clearly legible. Margaret's hand shook as she examined the bracelet. This had to be connected to Hope. It was too much of a coincidence for it not to be. But how had it ended up buried in her backyard? And more importantly, who was Rebecca and what had happened to her? Rex seemed to sense the importance of his discovery. He sat perfectly still while Margaret examined the bracelet, his eyes fixed on her face as if gauging her reaction. When she finally looked up at him, she could swear she saw satisfaction in his expression, as if this had been his intention all along. "Good boy," she whispered, though the discovery raised more questions than it answered. "How did you know this was here?" That afternoon, while Hope napped peacefully in her crib, Margaret found herself studying the medical record number on the bracelet. She knew she should probably contact Detective Morrison, as he had instructed, but the warning in the anonymous note made her hesitate. If she couldn't trust people in uniform, who could she trust? Her contemplation was interrupted by a knock at her front door. Not the authoritative pounding of law enforcement, but a gentler, more tentative sound. Rex immediately took up his guard position, but his posture was watchful rather than aggressive. Through the peephole, Margaret could see a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She was wearing casual clothes and carried a small handbag, nothing that suggested any official capacity. "Mrs. Thompson," the woman called softly, "my name is Linda Patterson. I live over on Oak Street. I was wondering if I might speak with you for a moment." Margaret recognized the name. Linda Patterson was known in the neighborhood as someone who volunteered at the local animal shelter and organized community food drives. If anyone could be trusted, it would be someone like Linda. "What about?" Margaret asked through the door, still cautious despite her positive impression of the woman. "I think we have a mutual concern," Linda replied cryptically, "about recent events in the neighborhood. I may have some information that could be helpful." Rex's ears perked up at the word information, and he looked at Margaret as if encouraging her to open the door. After a moment's hesitation, Margaret unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door just wide enough to see Linda's face clearly. "Mrs. Patterson," Margaret said politely, "what kind of information?" Linda glanced around nervously before speaking. "The kind that might be dangerous to discuss in the open. May I come in? I promise I'm not here to cause any trouble." Something in Linda's manner convinced Margaret to step aside and allow her to enter. Rex sniffed the newcomer carefully, but seemed to approve, settling into a relaxed but watchful position near Margaret's chair. "I know about the baby," Linda said quietly, once they were seated in Margaret's living room. "And I know you've had some official visitors asking questions." Margaret felt her heart rate increase. "How do you know about that?" "Because I've been watching," Linda admitted. "Not spying," she added quickly, seeing Margaret's alarmed expression. "Protecting. Mrs. Thompson, there are things happening in this situation that go far beyond what they appear on the surface." "What kind of things?" Margaret asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Linda reached into her handbag and pulled out a manila folder. "3 weeks ago, my daughter Jennifer works as a records clerk at Willowbrook General Hospital. She's not supposed to discuss patient information, but she came to me because she was worried about something she had seen." "What did she see?" "A young woman named Rebecca Hartwell was brought to the hospital in labor. She was alone, frightened, and kept asking for someone named David. But here's the strange part. After the baby was born, there was a lot of official activity around her. Case. Men in suits, hushed conversations, paperwork that disappeared from her file." Margaret's mouth went dry. "Rebecca Hartwell. That was the name on the hospital bracelet." Linda nodded grimly. "Jennifer said the young woman seemed terrified of something, kept saying that they would take her baby away. The morning after she gave birth, Rebecca disappeared from the hospital. No discharge paperwork, no forwarding address. Nothing. It was as if she had never been there at all." "But what happened to her?" Margaret asked, clutching the armrest of her chair. "No one knows," Linda replied. "But Jennifer managed to make copies of some of the paperwork before it disappeared. That's when things got really interesting." Linda opened the folder and pulled out several photocopied documents. Even from across the room, Margaret could see official letterheads and legal terminology scattered throughout the pages. "Rebecca Hartwell isn't just any young mother," Linda continued. "According to these documents, she's the sole heir to a substantial trust fund established by her deceased grandparents. The trust is worth over $2 million, and it can only be claimed by Rebecca or her direct descendants." Margaret felt the pieces of a puzzle beginning to click into place. So, if something happened to Rebecca and if her baby disappeared, the money would eventually revert to the secondary beneficiaries listed in the trust, Linda finished. "And, according to these papers, those secondary beneficiaries have been very eager to have the trust resolved in their favor." The room fell silent as Margaret processed this information. Hope, sleeping peacefully upstairs, wasn't just an abandoned baby. She was potentially worth millions of dollars to people who had already demonstrated they were willing to go to extreme lengths to claim what they believed was theirs. "Mrs. Thompson," Linda said seriously, "I think that baby upstairs is Rebecca Hartwell's daughter. And I think there are people who want to make sure she never grows up to claim her inheritance." Rex's head suddenly snapped toward the front window, his ears pricked and his body tense. A moment later, Margaret heard what had caught his attention: the sound of a car engine idling outside her house. Both women moved quickly to the window and peered through the curtains. The same dark sedan from the night before was parked across the street, its tinted windows making it impossible to see inside. They know you have information, Linda whispered urgently. Mrs. Thompson, you and that baby may be in more danger than you realize. As if responding to some unseen signal, the car's engine revved and it pulled away from the curb, disappearing around the corner. But Margaret knew it would be back, and next time, the people inside might not be content to simply watch. What do we do? Margaret asked, feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had learned. Linda reached over and squeezed her hand. We protect that little girl, she said firmly, and we find out what really happened to her mother. But first, we need to make sure you're safe. Rex moved to the front door and sat down, facing it, every line of his body radiating determination. Whatever came next, Margaret knew that the German Shepherd would be ready to defend Hope with his life. The question was whether that would be enough against the forces that seemed to be closing in around them. Margaret barely slept that night. Every sound from the street made her heart race. Every creak of her old house seemed amplified in the darkness. Rex had positioned himself by the front door, his ears constantly rotating like radar dishes, picking up every sound from the neighborhood. Hope, mercifully, seemed unaware of the tension that had settled over the household like a suffocating blanket. At 3 in the morning, Margaret was jolted awake by Rex's low growl. She crept to her bedroom window and peered through the blinds, her heart sinking when she saw not one, but 2 dark cars parked at different points along her street. They sat like predators, waiting for the right moment to strike. The cars remained until just before dawn, when they disappeared as silently as they had arrived. Margaret realized that whoever was behind this surveillance wanted her to know she was being watched. It was a form of psychological warfare designed to wear down her resistance and make her more compliant. By 8 o'clock the next morning, Margaret was exhausted and on edge. She was preparing Hope's morning feeding when she heard a car door slam outside, followed by the sound of purposeful footsteps approaching her front door. Rex immediately went on alert, but instead of growling, he made a sound that was almost like a whine of recognition. The knock that came was familiar, gentle but insistent. It was Linda Patterson, and she wasn't alone. Through the peephole, Margaret could see Linda standing with a tall, distinguished-looking African-American man in his 60s. He wore a simple polo shirt and khakis, but there was something about his bearing that suggested authority and competence. Mrs. Thompson, Linda called softly. This is Thomas Bailey. He's a retired police chief from Nashville, and he's here to help. Margaret opened the door cautiously, noting that Rex seemed to approve of the newcomer. Thomas Bailey had kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of a man who wasn't afraid of hard work. Mrs. Thompson, he said in a deep, reassuring voice, Linda filled me in on the situation. I want you to know that you're not alone in this. Once, they were seated in her living room, with Hope sleeping peacefully in Margaret's arms. Thomas explained why he had come. I've seen situations like this before, he said grimly. When large amounts of money are at stake, people will go to extraordinary lengths to eliminate anyone who stands in their way. The fact that they're surveilling you openly tells me they're trying to intimidate you into giving up the baby voluntarily. But I can't do that, Margaret said firmly. This child needs protection, not to be handed over to people who see her as nothing more than an obstacle. And that's exactly why we're here, Linda interjected. Thomas has some ideas about how we can keep Hope safe while we work to expose what's really happening. Thomas leaned forward, his expression serious. The first thing we need to understand is that you can't trust the official channels right now. If there's this much money involved, it's likely that some of the people who should be protecting this child have been compromised. Margaret thought about Detective Morrison's cryptic warnings and his instruction not to discuss the case with anyone. Had he been trying to protect her, or was he part of whatever conspiracy was unfolding? "What do you suggest we do?" she asked. "We build our own network," Thomas replied. "Community protection. There are good people in this neighborhood who would be willing to help if they understood what was at stake." Over the next hour, Thomas outlined a plan that was both simple and ingenious. Instead of hiding Hope's presence, they would make her protection a community effort. Neighbors would take turns watching the house, creating a network of eyes and ears that would make it difficult for anyone to approach unnoticed. "But will people really be willing to get involved?" Margaret asked. "This could be dangerous." Linda smiled. "Mrs. Thompson, you'd be surprised how many people in this neighborhood have been watching your situation with concern. People have noticed the strange cars, the official visits. They may not know the details, but they know something isn't right." That afternoon, Linda and Thomas began making discreet visits to houses throughout the neighborhood. Margaret watched from her window as they spoke quietly with various residents, gesturing occasionally toward her house. Rex seemed to understand what was happening and had taken up a permanent position by the front window, monitoring all the activity. The first person to respond to their call for help was Helen Martinez, a retired teacher who lived directly across the street. Helen arrived at Margaret's door, carrying a covered casserole dish and wearing a determined expression. "I don't know exactly what's going on," Helen said as Margaret invited her in. "But Linda told me that you and this baby need protection from some very bad people. I want you to know that I'm prepared to help however I can." Helen's presence seemed to open the floodgates. Over the next few hours, a steady stream of neighbors made their way to Margaret's door. There was Frank Morrison, an elderly widower who had served in Vietnam and still maintained the sharp awareness of a soldier. Susan and David Kim, a young couple who worked from home and could maintain surveillance during the day. Even Mrs. Chen from the pharmacy arrived, bringing supplies and offering to serve as a safe house if Margaret and Hope needed to be moved quickly. By evening, Margaret found herself sitting in her living room surrounded by people she had known only as distant neighbors, all united in their determination to protect Hope. Rex moved among them like a gracious host, seeming to evaluate each person's commitment and sincerity. "We need to establish some ground rules," Thomas said, taking charge of the impromptu meeting. "First, we maintain normal routines as much as possible. We don't want to appear to be organizing any kind of resistance. Second, we use a simple communication system. If anyone sees anything suspicious, they call the next person on the list, and that person calls the next until everyone is alerted." Frank Morrison, the Vietnam veteran, raised his hand. "What about weapons? If these people are as dangerous as you say, we might need to be prepared to defend ourselves." Thomas shook his head. "No weapons. If we escalate to that level, we give them justification for escalating as well. Our strength is in numbers and in being visible. These people prefer to work in shadows. If we shine light on everything they do, they become much less effective." Susan Kim, who worked in information technology, had been listening quietly throughout the meeting. "What about documentation?" she asked. "If we're going to expose what's happening, we need evidence. I can set up a system to record and catalog everything we observe." Margaret felt a surge of gratitude as she listened to these people, most of whom she barely knew, calmly discussing how to risk their own safety to protect a baby who wasn't even related to any of them. Hope seemed to sense the positive energy in the room and had been unusually calm and alert, her bright eyes taking in all the new faces. "There's something else we need to consider," Linda said. "You say, did you? Rebecca Hartwell, Hope's mother, if she's still alive, she has a right to know that her daughter is safe. And if she's not..." Linda paused, unwilling to voice the alternative. "I may be able to help with that," Helen Martinez said unexpectedly. I still have contacts at the school district from my teaching days. If Rebecca grew up in this area, there would be records, former classmates, people who might know her family. Thomas nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of network thinking we need. Everyone here has connections, knowledge, and skills that could be useful. The people who want to harm Hope are counting on us being isolated and powerless. They're not expecting an entire community to stand against them. As the meeting broke up and neighbors returned to their homes, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The sense of being part of something larger than herself. Rex seemed to share her mood, moving between the departing visitors with what could only be described as a satisfied air. The first test of their new security network came at 11 o'clock that night. Margaret was giving Hope her final feeding of the day when her phone rang. It was Frank Morrison calling from his house across the street. "Margaret, we've got company," he said in a low, urgent voice. 3 cars this time, positioned at different points around the block. They're trying to box in your house. Within minutes, Margaret's phone was ringing constantly as the communication chain activated. Each neighbor reported their observations, the positions of the cars, the number of people inside them, any unusual activity. Susan Kim was live streaming the surveillance from her window and uploading it to a cloud server as backup evidence. But something unexpected happened. Instead of remaining hidden in shadows as they had before, the occupants of the cars seemed to realize they were being watched by multiple sources. One by one, the vehicles started their engines and drove away, clearly frustrated by the impossibility of conducting covert surveillance under so many watchful eyes. Thomas called Margaret directly after the cars had departed. "They're testing a response," he said. "Tonight was a probe to see how organized we are. They'll be back, but now they know they're not dealing with one frightened woman. They're dealing with an entire community." Margaret looked down at Hope, who had fallen asleep in her arms with the trusting innocence of a child who had no idea how many people were working to keep her safe. Rex stretched out on the floor beside her chair, his presence a constant reminder of how this whole journey had begun. "Thomas," Margaret said into the phone, "I need to ask you something. Do you really think we can protect her against people with this kind of resources and determination?" There was a pause before Thomas answered, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of experience and hard-won wisdom. "Margaret, I've seen ordinary people do extraordinary things when they're fighting for what's right. These people who want to harm Hope, they're motivated by greed. We're motivated by love and justice. In my experience, that's a much more powerful force." As Margaret prepared for another sleepless night, she found herself thinking about the strange chain of events that had brought them all together. Rex's rescue of Hope from the garbage, his instinctive choice to bring her to Margaret's door, the mysterious warnings and clues that had helped them understand the true nature of the threat they faced. It was almost as if some unseen force was working to protect Hope, using ordinary people and one extraordinary dog to stand against those who would harm an innocent child. Margaret settled into her rocking chair with Hope in her arms, Rex at her feet, and the knowledge that an entire neighborhood was watching over them. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. The morning brought an unexpected visitor to Maple Avenue. Margaret was watching from her window as a silver Honda Civic pulled up to her curb, driven by a woman who appeared to be in her late 60s, with steel gray hair pulled back in an elegant chignon. The woman wore a navy blue blazer and carried herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to commanding respect in professional settings. Rex, who had become extraordinarily attuned to the approach of any vehicle, watched alertly, but without the tension he displayed when the dark surveillance cars appeared. Something about this visitor seemed different, purposeful, but not threatening. The woman walked directly to Margaret's front door with confident steps and knocked with a rhythm that suggested patience and determination rather than urgency or aggression. "Mrs. Thompson," she called in a clear, authoritative voice. "My name is Sarah Coleman. I'm a retired attorney, and I believe I can help you with your current situation." Margaret hesitated, unsure whether to trust another stranger who claimed to have knowledge of her circumstances. Rex, however, seemed to have made his decision. He approached the door and sat down in what Margaret had learned was his signal that he considered the visitor acceptable. "What kind of help?" Margaret asked through the door. "The legal kind," Sarah replied. "I have reason to believe that the child in your care has been wrongfully targeted for removal from her rightful inheritance. I have documents that I think you need to see." The word inheritance made Margaret's pulse quicken. This had to be connected to the information Linda had shared about Rebecca Hartwell and the trust fund. After a moment's consideration, Margaret opened the door. Sarah Coleman was even more impressive in person than she had appeared from the window. Her handshake was firm, her eyes sharp with intelligence, and she carried a leather briefcase that looked well used and professional. She smiled warmly when she saw Hope sleeping in Margaret's arms. "Beautiful child," Sarah said softly. "She has no idea how many people are fighting over her future." Once they were settled in the living room, Sarah opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder of documents. Rex positioned himself where he could observe both the visitor and the papers she was displaying. "Mrs. Thompson, how much do you know about the Hartwell Family Trust?" Sarah asked. "Only what Linda Patterson told me," Margaret replied, "that Rebecca Hartwell was the primary beneficiary of a substantial inheritance and that Hope might be her daughter." Sarah nodded grimly. "That's correct. But the situation is even more complex than you've been told. The Hartwell Trust was established in 1987 by Rebecca's grandparents, Henry and Eleanor Hartwell, who made their fortune in real estate development. The trust is worth approximately $2.8 million, and it was designed to provide for Rebecca and any direct descendants. But Rebecca disappeared from the hospital," Margaret said. "What happens to the money if she can't claim it?" "That's where things get interesting," Sarah replied, spreading several documents across the coffee table. The original trust documents contained very specific language about what would happen in the event that Rebecca was unable or unwilling to claim her inheritance. If Rebecca died or was declared legally incompetent, and if she had no living children, the money would go to the secondary beneficiaries. Who are the secondary beneficiaries? Sarah pointed to a section of one of the documents. Rebecca's Uncle Martin Hartwell and his business partner Charles Brennan. They've been waiting 36 years for an opportunity to claim this money. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. So, if something happened to Rebecca and if Hope disappeared, they would inherit everything, Sarah confirmed. But here's the crucial detail that makes this case so important. The trust documents also state that if Rebecca has a living child, that child becomes the primary beneficiary upon reaching the age of 18, regardless of what happens to Rebecca herself. Margaret looked down at Hope, sleeping peacefully and completely unaware that her very existence threatened someone's financial plans. So, Hope is worth millions of dollars to some people and worth nothing to others. Exactly. And that makes her extremely dangerous to Martin Hartwell and Charles Brennan. As long as she's alive, they can't claim the inheritance. Rex suddenly lifted his head and moved to the window, his attention focused on something outside. Margaret joined him and saw a white van parked at the corner, the same van that had been making regular appearances in the neighborhood over the past few days. "They're watching us right now, aren't they?" Margaret asked. Sarah glanced out the window and her expression hardened. Most likely, Mrs. Thompson, I need to ask you something important. Have you been contacted by anyone claiming to represent Child Protective Services or any other official agency? 2 detectives came to see me a few days ago, Margaret replied. They said they were investigating the baby's abandonment, but they seemed to know more about the situation than they were letting on. Sarah's face grew grim. Can you describe them? Margaret gave detailed descriptions of Detective Morrison and Detective Williams and watched as Sarah's expression became increasingly troubled. Mrs. Thompson, I've been investigating this case for several weeks, ever since my former colleague contacted me about some irregularities in the way Rebecca's hospital disappearance was handled. There are no detectives named Morrison and Williams working on this case for the Willowbrook Police Department. The room seemed to spin around Margaret as the implications of this revelation sank in. Then who were they? Most likely private investigators or security personnel hired by Martin Hartwell and Charles Brennan. The fact that they allowed you to keep hope suggests they were still trying to determine the best way to handle the situation without drawing unwanted attention. Margaret sank into her chair, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of the deception. But they seemed so official, so legitimate. That's exactly what they were counting on, Sarah said. Mrs. Thompson, I need you to understand something. These people have unlimited resources and decades of experience in manipulating legal and administrative systems. They've probably been planning for this contingency ever since Rebecca turned 18 and became eligible to claim her inheritance. But what about Rebecca? Margaret asked desperately. If she's Hope's mother, doesn't she have rights? Shouldn't we be trying to find her? Sarah's expression became even more serious. That's another reason why I'm here. Mrs. Thompson, I've been conducting my own investigation into Rebecca's disappearance, and I've uncovered some disturbing information. Sarah pulled out another set of documents and spread them on the table. Rebecca didn't just disappear from the hospital. She was systematically isolated and manipulated in the weeks leading up to Hope's birth. Her apartment lease was terminated. Without her knowledge, her bank accounts were frozen due to irregularities, and she was convinced that she was in danger. Convinced by whom? By people working for Martin Hartwell and Charles Brennan. They wanted her frightened and alone, completely dependent on their help and guidance. The plan was to convince her to sign away her rights to the trust, in exchange for protection and a small settlement. Margaret felt sick to her stomach. But she had the baby before they could get her to sign anything. Exactly. And that changed everything. Suddenly they weren't just dealing with Rebecca, they were dealing with Rebecca's heir. A child who would inherit everything when she turned 18, regardless of what Rebecca chose to do. Rex had returned to his position by Margaret's chair, but his attention remained fixed on the window. The van was still there, and Margaret could see movement inside it, suggesting that multiple people were conducting surveillance. Sarah, Margaret said quietly, where is Rebecca now? Is she safe? Sarah hesitated before answering. I believe Rebecca is alive, but she's been hidden away somewhere, probably convinced that Hope was lost and that she needs to remain in hiding for her own safety. The people behind this scheme have had weeks to establish a complete false narrative about what happened that night. So she thinks her baby is gone? Most likely. And she's been told that if she ever tries to surface or claim her inheritance, she'll be in mortal danger. Margaret looked down at Hope, who had begun to stir and make the small sounds that indicated she was waking up. How do we fix this? How do we reunite Hope with her mother and expose the truth? Sarah leaned forward, her expression determined. We gather evidence, we document everything, and we find Rebecca before Hartwell and Brennan realize that we know the truth. But Mrs. Thompson, I need to warn you, once we start this process, there's no going back. These people will become increasingly desperate as they realize their plan is unraveling. What does that mean for Hope's safety? It means we need to be smarter and more organized than they are. And it means we need to be prepared for them to escalate their tactics. As if summoned by Sarah's words, Margaret's phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but something compelled her to answer. Mrs. Thompson. The voice was professional, polite, but there was an underlying edge that made Margaret's skin crawl. This is David Sterling with Child Protective Services. We need to schedule an immediate welfare check for the infant in your care. Margaret's heart pounded as she looked at Sarah, who was shaking her head vigorously and mouthing the word, no. Sorry, Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady. The baby is fine. We've already been visited by the appropriate authorities. I'm afraid there's been some confusion about that, the voice continued. The previous visit was preliminary. We now need to conduct a full evaluation and determine the best placement for the child's long-term welfare. Sarah was frantically writing on a piece of paper, which she held up for Margaret to see. Ask for his supervisor's name and direct phone number. Can you give me your supervisor's name and direct phone number? Margaret asked. I'd like to verify this call. There was a pause. Then the line went dead. Sarah smiled grimly. Excellent. A real CPS worker would have gladly provided that information. This confirms that we're dealing with more imposters. Rex had begun pacing again, and Margaret could see why. The white van had been joined by a dark sedan, and both vehicles seemed to be positioning themselves for some kind of coordinated action. Sarah, Margaret said urgently, I think we're about to have company. Sarah quickly gathered her documents and stuffed them back into her briefcase. Mrs. Thompson, do you have a back exit from this house? Through the kitchen to the backyard, but the fence. Don't worry about the fence. Is there a neighbor who can help us? Margaret thought immediately of Helen Martinez across the street and of the network Thomas Bailey had helped them establish. Yes, but what about Hope? Sarah stood up and moved toward the kitchen. We take her with us. Mrs. Thompson, these people have been playing a very careful game up until now, but something has changed. They're moving from surveillance to action, which means they've decided they can't wait any longer. As Margaret gathered Hope and the diaper bag, Rex positioned himself at the front door, his body tense and ready. Whatever was about to happen, the German Shepherd was prepared to do whatever it took to protect the baby he had rescued from the storm. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message from Frank Morrison across the street. 6 men getting out of the vehicles, armed with what looked like official badges. Time to go. Sarah grabbed Margaret's arm. Back door, now. We're about to find out just how but these people are willing to go to claim that inheritance. The drive to Serenity Hills took 45 minutes through winding country roads that seemed to lead deeper into isolation with each mile. Margaret sat in the passenger seat of Sarah's Honda, nervously reviewing the fake medical credentials that Susan Kim had created for her. According to the documents, Margaret was Dr. Margaret Thompson, a specialist in trauma-related memory disorders. Remember, Sarah said as they approached, the facility's gates. We're here because I have concerns about my client's mental health treatment. You're the independent expert I've brought to evaluate her condition. Let me do most of the talking. Serenity Hills looked exactly like what it was designed to appear to be. A peaceful, private hospital surrounded by manicured gardens and tasteful architecture. But Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that its serene appearance was hiding something much darker. The administrator who met them in the lobby was a thin, nervous man named Dr. Peterson, who seemed uncomfortable with their unannounced visit. His hands shook slightly as he reviewed Sarah's legal documents. and he made several phone calls before agreeing to allow them to see Rebecca. "I should warn you," Dr. Peterson said, as he led them through carpeted hallways lined with soothing artwork. "Miss Miller has been quite fragile since her arrival. She's made significant progress, but any discussion of her previous trauma could cause a setback." Sarah's jaw tightened. "By previous trauma, you mean the supposed loss of her child?" "Among other things, yes. She arrived here in a state of severe psychological distress, convinced that she had given birth to a baby who had somehow survived. We've been working to help her accept the reality that the infant was stillborn." Margaret felt sick to her stomach, but she forced herself to maintain her professional demeanor. The cruelty of convincing a mother that her living child was dead was almost beyond comprehension. They found Rebecca in a small, comfortable room overlooking the facility's gardens. She was sitting by the window, staring out at the trees with an expression of profound sadness. Margaret's heart nearly broke when she saw her. Rebecca was barely 25 years old, with dark hair and delicate features that strongly resembled Hope's. "Rebecca," Sarah said gently, "my name is Sarah Coleman. I'm an attorney and I've been trying to find you for several weeks." Rebecca turned toward them slowly, and Margaret could see the effects of whatever medications they had been giving her. Her movements were sluggish, her eyes unfocused, but there was still intelligence there, still a spark of the person she had been before this nightmare began. "I don't understand," Rebecca said in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "Dr. Peterson told me that no one was looking for me. He said it was safer for me to stay here until I was better." Sarah sat down in the chair next to Rebecca's bed. "Rebecca, I need to ask you some very important questions, and I need you to try to remember, even if it's difficult. Do you remember giving birth to a baby?" Rebecca's face crumpled, and tears began streaming down her cheeks. "They told me I was imagining it. They said the trauma made me create false memories, but I can still feel her, you know. I can still feel my baby moving inside me, and I remember holding her just for a moment before—" "Before what?" Margaret asked gently. "Before they took her away. They said there were complications, that she didn't make it. But I heard her crying. I know I heard her crying." Sarah reached into her briefcase and pulled out a photograph that Susan Kim had printed from one of the surveillance videos. A clear image of Margaret holding Hope in her kitchen. "Rebecca," Sarah said softly, "your baby is alive. Her name is Hope, and she's been living with a wonderful woman named Margaret, who has been taking excellent care of her." Rebecca stared at the photograph as if she couldn't process what she was seeing. Her hands trembled as she reached for it, and Margaret could see the exact moment when recognition dawned in her eyes. "That's her," Rebecca whispered. "That's my baby. She's alive. She's really alive." "She's beautiful and healthy and safe," Margaret said, tears flowing freely down her own cheeks. "And she needs her mother." What happened next transformed Rebecca completely. The lethargy and confusion that had clouded her features disappeared, replaced by a fierce maternal energy that no amount of medication could suppress. "I have to see her," Rebecca said, standing up with sudden strength. "I have to go to her. Right now." Dr. Peterson, who had been hovering in the doorway, stepped forward with alarm. "Ms. Miller, you're not ready for discharge. You need to continue your treatment program before you can handle the stress." The stress of what?" Rebecca snapped, her voice stronger than it had been since they arrived. "The stress of being reunited with my living daughter? The stress of learning that you've been lying to me for weeks?" Sarah stood up and faced Dr. Peterson directly. "Doctor, you can either discharge my client voluntarily, or I can have law enforcement officers here within the hour to investigate the illegal detention of a competent adult. Which would you prefer? Dr. Peterson's face went pale, and Margaret could see him calculating the legal implications of the situation. After a moment of internal struggle, he nodded reluctantly. "I'll prepare the discharge paperwork," he said, "but I want it noted that this is against medical advice." "Noted," Sarah replied curtly. The drive back toward Willowbrook was filled with Rebecca's questions about Hope, how she had been found, who had been caring for her, whether she was healthy and developing normally. Margaret answered each question with the kind of detail that only someone who had fallen in love with the baby could provide. "The dog," Rebecca said suddenly. "You said a dog found her in the garbage. Where is he now?" "Rex is with Hope," Margaret explained. "He's been her protector from the very beginning. I think he knew somehow that she belonged with someone who would love her." Rebecca was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "I want to meet him. I want to thank him for saving my daughter when I couldn't." They had arranged to meet Linda at a small park halfway between Serenity Hills and Willowbrook, a neutral location where Rebecca could be reunited with Hope without risking exposure to Martin Hartwell's surveillance network. As they pulled into the parking lot, Margaret could see Linda's car already waiting under a grove of oak trees. Linda was sitting on a bench with Hope in her arms, and Rex was lying at her feet in a relaxed but watchful pose. The moment Rebecca stepped out of Sarah's car, Rex's head came up and his ears perked forward. It was as if he recognized something familiar about her, some connection to the baby he had protected for so long. The reunion between Rebecca and Hope was everything Margaret had hoped it would be and more. The moment Rebecca took her daughter in her arms, Hope seemed to recognize her mother instinctively. The baby's fussing stopped immediately, replaced by alert, focused attention as she studied Rebecca's face. "Hello, my beautiful girl," Rebecca whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Mommy's here. Mommy's finally here." Rex approached cautiously, as if uncertain of his role now that mother and daughter were together. Rebecca noticed him immediately and extended her free hand toward him. "Are you Rex?" she asked softly. "Are you the one who saved my baby?" Rex allowed her to pet him, and Margaret could swear she saw relief in his expression, as if a burden he had been carrying for weeks was finally being lifted from his shoulders. But their peaceful reunion was interrupted by the sound of approaching vehicles. 3 black SUVs were speeding toward the park, and Margaret's heart sank as she recognized the aggressive driving style of Martin Hartwell's security team. "They found us," Sarah said grimly. "Everyone stay calm. Remember, we have the law on our side now." The SUVs surrounded the park area, and Margaret counted at least a dozen men emerging from the vehicles. Martin Hartwell himself stepped out of the lead vehicle, his face twisted with rage and desperation. "Rebecca!" he called out across the park. "Thank God we found you. These people have been keeping you from your treatment. We need to get you back to the hospital immediately." Rebecca stood up, holding Hope protectively against her chest. "Uncle Martin," she said in a voice that carried across the distance between them, "why did you tell me my baby was dead?" The question hit Hartwell like a physical blow. Margaret could see him calculating rapidly, trying to determine how much Rebecca knew and how he could still salvage his plan. "Rebecca, you've been very sick," he said, approaching slowly with his hands held out in what was meant to be a calming gesture. "You're not thinking clearly. That baby isn't yours. These people have manipulated you into believing something that isn't true." Rex moved to stand between Hartwell and Rebecca, his body language making it clear that he would not allow the man to get any closer. Sarah stepped forward as well, holding up an official-looking document. "Mr. Hartwell," Sarah announced in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, You are hereby served with a temporary restraining order preventing you from having any contact with Rebecca Hartwell or her daughter. Additionally, the FBI has been notified of your involvement in conspiracy, fraud, and illegal detention charges. Hartwell's face went white. FBI? What are you talking about? I've been trying to help my niece. By convincing her that her living child was dead, Rebecca shouted, her voice breaking with emotion. By having me drugged and held in a facility against my will. By trying to steal my inheritance. The confrontation might have escalated further, but at that moment, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. True to Sarah's word, law enforcement was arriving, but these were real officers with legitimate authority. As federal agents began taking Martin Hartwell and his associates into custody, Margaret found herself sitting on the park bench with Rebecca and Hope, watching Rex play gently with the baby he had saved from the storm. Mrs. Thompson, Rebecca said quietly, I don't know how to thank you for taking care of Hope. She's so happy, so healthy. You must have loved her very much. Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes. I did love her, I still do, but she belongs with you, Rebecca. She always belonged with you. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, then looked at Margaret with an expression of determination. I want you to know that you'll always be part of Hope's life, if you want to be. You and Rex both. You're her family too now. As the sun began to set over the park, Margaret watched Rebecca feeding Hope while Rex dozed contentedly. At their feet, the dog had fulfilled his mysterious mission, bringing together a family that had been torn apart by greed and deception. Sarah approached with good news. The FBI found evidence of the entire conspiracy at Hartwell's office. He and Brennan will be facing federal charges, and the legal challenges to Rebecca's inheritance have been withdrawn. Hope will grow up knowing that her trust fund is secure. But more importantly, Margaret thought as she watched the reunion unfold before her, Hope would grow up knowing that she was loved, wanted, and protected by people who would do anything to keep her safe. Rex opened one amber eye and looked at Margaret as if reading her thoughts. His tail thumped once against the ground in what she had learned was his signal of contentment and approval. 3 months later, Margaret's house on Maple Avenue had become the unofficial headquarters for Hope's extended family. Rebecca had moved into the neighborhood to be close to Margaret, and Rex had appointed himself as Hope's permanent guardian, accompanying her everywhere and sleeping beside her crib every night. The community that had come together to protect Hope remained close, bound by the shared experience of standing up for what was right. Thomas Bailey continued to organize neighborhood watch activities, though now they were focused on more routine concerns. Linda Patterson had become Rebecca's close friend and Hope's honorary grandmother, and Margaret had discovered that her quiet life was much richer when filled with the laughter of a growing baby and the companionship of friends who had become family. On quiet evenings, when Hope was sleeping and Rex was stretched out on the living room floor, Margaret would sometimes think about that stormy night when everything changed. She had no doubt that some unseen force had guided Rex to find Hope in the garbage and bring her to safety. But perhaps the real miracle wasn't the rescue itself. It was the way that one act of compassion had brought together an entire community of people willing to fight for an innocent child's future. Hope was learning to walk now, taking her first tentative steps between Rebecca's arms and Margaret's outstretched hands, with Rex watching proudly from the sidelines. And Margaret knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, this little girl would never face them alone. She had been found by a guardian angel with 4 legs and a faithful heart, and she would grow up surrounded by a family that chose to love her, which, Margaret reflected, was often the strongest kind of family of all. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Margaret, Rebecca, Hope, and the faithful Rex has touched your hearts as much as it has ours. In a world that can sometimes feel cold and disconnected, this tale reminds us that love, community, and determination can overcome even the most calculated schemes. The bond between a protective dog, a caring neighbor, and an innocent child shows us that families are not just born. They are chosen, nurtured, and defended by those who recognize the preciousness of every life. If this story has moved you, we have prepared a special playlist of equally captivating stories that explore the depths of human compassion and the power of unexpected friendships. You can find it by clicking to your left. If you enjoyed this emotional journey, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you unique stories that examine the complexity of life and the beautiful connections that bind us all together. We can't wait to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. Share with us a time when an unexpected guardian appeared in your life, or when you became someone else's protector. Your stories inspire us to continue bringing you content that celebrates the very best of human nature. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey, and we'll see you in our next story.